Hey YouTube viewers, got a simple job for today. The seal on my full floating hub on my Dana Rear 60 on the J20 is leaking onto the drum, which gets it on the shoes. It's going to ruin my braking. So I'm going to take you along for the task of replacing the seals on the rear hub. Bit different from a semi-float axle. So follow along. Let me know what you think. Subscribe if you like it. Comment, like it, down below. Alright, first take off the wheel. Next, 5/8" socket. We'll use that. Take off the axle flange bolt. Ah, the sweet smell of differential fluid. Now, I had to silicone this on to seal up the old gasket, which was not readily available. Got new ones now. But I have to knock that off with a few taps, maybe some prying, maybe a bit of both. Let's first try the non-caveman way. Give myself a prying point. There we go. Came right loose. And there goes my axle fluid. Luckily, a rag and a drain band catch it. Take your axle out, put it safely to the side. Never a bad idea to have a roll of shop towels on hand. Alright. Next, the screw holding the drum to the hub. Then we pull off the hub. Probably be able to see what that leak is doing. There we go. You can see right there. The leaky seal on this hub here is dripping down onto my drum and was fouling my brake shoes. So, I'm going to clean that up. Make sure this doesn't leak anymore. First, bend back the locking tabs, holding this lock nut in place. This, for much of its life, was a plow truck. So, it did not have a lot of side-to-side movement. The owner would plow forward, plow backwards, forward, backwards. And the axle fluid got low, probably because of this leaky seal. When I filled it back up again, axle fluid or differential fluid would slosh from side to side, lubricating the bearings. Once I take it off, I'll be able to feel and inspect the surface of those bearings to see if they're going to need replacement. Right now, I've got to take off the first outer spindle nut, which should be a bit tighter than that. You shouldn't be able to remove that by hand. Okay, now we take off the spindle nuts and the retainer. You want a 6.2 3/8" socket, not one with a rounded corner, but one with the sharp pointed 6-point corners. This is for other axles. This is the one you want. And depending on how well it was assembled previously, it might not be hard to get this off. This one, nope, it spins right off. They barely bent back the retaining tabs for the retainer inside. Let me pull that out. That's why it was probably loose. For this retainer, once you've installed the spindle nuts to spec, they're torqued in place, you bend these forward to lock in place that lock nut. On this one of them was bent backwards. It's not quite what you want. Then the inner spindle nut might be able to just spin off by hand. There we go. And always have ready a cloth, because that outer bearing is no longer held in place by anything. So when you pull on this axle, when you pull on this hub, it's going to pop right out. See? Like that. The other is held by a retainer, a seal, and that's what we're going to replace. So let's go over to the tailgate and replace that seal. Okay, now I've got the seal puller set up with the hub and the vise. See, it's starting to pull up out of the bore. There we go. Seal destroyed but pulled. That allows us to pull out the inner bearing. I don't see any damage. Grooves on the race inside, and the rollers look good. So we'll clean this up and just put it all back together. Alright, I cleaned up the bearings. They look like they're in good shape, so I don't have to replace these. The races are also in good shape. So it's just a matter of greasing them up and installing them in the axle. They're going to be lubricated by the gear oil, but you want to give them a head start by just putting enough grease to get it going. Eventually this grease will be washed away by gear oil, and then that gear oil will lubricate these bearings. Make sure it's all in between the bearings. Like I said, it doesn't have to be completely lubed, but enough to get you going. You don't want this starting up dry. Well, I got grease all over my fingers. I greased the outer bearing as well. It's the smaller of the two. That inner bearing is a Timken 28678. This outer bearing is a Timken 18690. These may very well be the original bearings on the truck. So 144,000 miles to have this little wear. Either someone's maintained it, probably someone has maintained it. Nothing would survive abuse for that long. Spin them around. There you go, we got a good start. Let's wipe these bearings down with the races down with some grease. You don't have to load it in there. Like I said, it's all going to get washed away anyway, but you want a good start. It turns smoothly. Time to drive this seal in. The seal is a national seal, although it comes in a Timken box. Made in the USA, made in the United States. It's a 455860 Timken seal, or national seal. I'm not quite sure who owns what these days. I don't have a seal driver big enough in my kit for driving this seal in. I'm going to use a piece of wood, flat against it, and a sledge. Okay, I want to show you something about this spindle. This has been sitting for a long time, and rust built up around the outer circumference just inside of where the seal sits. I suspect that that buildup of rust chipped away at that seal and likely caused the leak. I took some Scotch-Brite to it. I scraped off the big rust, but it's still rough. So if the seal were to ride up against that, it would tear as well, and I'd have another leak. So what I've done, I'll show you on the seal. So what I have done, instead of driving the seal flush with the inner edge of the hub, I drove it down just a little bit more, so that it's not going to ride on the further edge of this where there's some rust, but rather more toward the toward the outer part where the bearing sits. So I checked it by putting some grease on, sliding it into place, and then pulling it off. And you can see it's going to ride right here on the good part, because I knocked it down into its bore just a little bit more. Now it's time to reassemble everything. Okay, slide the outer bearing in till it seats in its race, and then you got to tighten. Let's see, which one was the inner one? This was the inner one. You're going to tighten the lock nut to 50 pounds while you're spinning it, and then back off, and then tighten it hand tight. That's how they determine bearing preload on these axles. So, spin that on down. It seats against the bearing. Set to 50 foot-pounds while you're spinning the hub. Tighten it, and by doing that, when you get to 50 foot-pounds, you'll have seated it. You want to be able to spin it though while it's seating. You don't want to lock the rollers into place, so spin it. It gets tight. There we go, 50 foot-pounds. Now we back it off and do it till it's snug. You do not want to leave it at 50 pounds. So just snug. It's a little too snug. While it's spinning, tighten it down. You can feel when there's too much drag and when there's just enough. You don't want to bind up the bearings. Now put your lock nut in place, your lock washer I should say, and then you tighten the outer nut to 50 pounds. And that lock washer is going to prevent this from tightening that inner nut anymore. Oop, that's too tight. That's going to bind up the bearings. Let me back off that inner bearing a little bit. Okay. So you're just putting this on hand tight while spinning it. Because when you put the outer bearing on, it's going to cinch it down a little bit more. There we go, it spins freely right there. We want it to spin with about that much freedom once we lock down the outer lock nut. Got my torque wrench set to 50 pounds. Actually, it's just a little too tight for my liking. Gotta back it off a 1/16 of a turn. Okay. That's that much. There we go. It doesn't keep spinning super freely, but it does spin freely. No lateral play. Now, pick whichever of these tabs is going to lie most flat against the outer lock nut and bend it out. You're going to use a large screwdriver. And the reason you want to bend it out is when you have to reinstall this, you have to bend it back in. And it's a lot easier to bend one of these tabs in than to try to get one to bend out from inside. Alright, I got it on 2. I can do it on 3 of them. There we go. The hub is installed. Now, it's time to put the outer gasket and the axle flange, the axle shaft with the axle flange on that. Okay, I've placed the aluminum gasket over the shaft on the inside of the flange. Slide the inner shaft in, slide the shaft in, it's not inner or outer, it's just a shaft, until it engages with the splines in the differential. Go, and then line up the holes in the hub, the holes in the flange. Torque the bolts down. Last time I installed this, I had to reuse that gasket, and it leaked unless I put silicone on it. So when I installed it, silicone got on these bolts, which is going to affect the torque values. I got this, what is it called? The Thread Wizard. It actually does a great job. It's got a little wheel with, you can see, bristles. Spin the screw on, spin that in a couple of times, and it cleans off the threads. Cleans off dirt, rust, grime. I think I've got to rotate that wheel. So right now, those threads are all gummed up. You can see when you take apart this Thread Wizard, it's got a little wheel in there, and whichever one you've been using the most, whichever size you've been using the most, tends to get the most gummed up. So what you do is just rotate the wheel, clean off all that junk, and you're ready for another out of cleaning. You see, you just put the wheel back in with some clean threads on the holes you're going to be using. Screw it back together, and you're good to go. Now that that's all cleaned up, you put the bolt in the right size hole, spray some solvent on it to help it get started, and then spin it in and out a few times. And that does a decent job of cleaning it up. Might take a few passes if it's particularly messy. There we go. Threads are nice and clean. Just going to do that for the rest of the bolts. Not going to bore you with that. Then you want to torque these. I've seen specs that say 115 foot-pounds. That can't be right. That would break these little bolts. I'm going to go 50 foot-pounds. Then it's just putting the wheel on and topping off the axle fluid so there's enough to get into this hub. Actually, there is one more job. It's a cleaning job. That's cleaning all the gear oil out of the drum that leaked into it. The brake shoes the linings were contaminated with the gear oil that dripped out. You can replace them or just clean them, and if it doesn't work, replace them anyway. At least you got a shot at reusing them. But clean them until you don't get any more black residue. And then the drum retainer screw. On these aftermarket drums, they're oriented so there's only one screw hole that'll work. Use that. Tighten it by hand. Now, time to mount the wheel. If you want to know how to tell your wheel hub is leaking, if you see a big stain on the ground underneath your rear wheel, it's not from brake fluid, it's probably from a leaking hub. If you don't see it dripping from this edge, which is where mine was dripping from the first time around, it's going to be dripping down into the brake drum and then out through the right between the drum and the backing plate. But in the meantime, it's going to foul your brake linings. That's why you've got to do this job. Drop it on the ground, then torque those to 120 pounds, and your job is done. Well, I got to go do the other side now, but I'm not going to show you that one. Same as this. All right, thank you for watching. You got to do your rear hubs, replace the seals. That's how you do it. All right, thank you for watching. Don't forget, click like, subscribe, ring the bell, I guess people say. I don't know what that is, but that's what you do on YouTube. Thanks for watching.